I want to thank very much for the sermonette we had on examining ourselves. Very appropriate as we approach the days of unleavened bread. And in fact, today I want to talk a little bit about preparation for Passover and the days of unleavened bread. We in God's church observe the annual holy days. So the question may be, where do we get the authority for observing the customs that we do and the tradition of how to observe them? Where do we get that authority? And this is particularly pertinent as we approach now the festival season, the beginning of the year festival season. In the States, we quite often call it spring holidays, but when I was in South Africa and I got these things that say spring holidays, it's not spring, it's autumn. Because in Southern Hemisphere it's the other way around. So I try and avoid saying the spring holidays, even though obviously the meaning is the spring season, because that's the meaning, but the people in other parts of the world sometimes get a bit confused with that. But as we approach these days, we really have to prepare ourselves and examine ourselves. We live in difficult times. And I mean, you and I just have to watch a little bit of the news to say, well, times are really bad. I don't need to go into any details in that. We all can see it. But Christ, and we don't have to turn there, but in Luke 21 says, watch and pray that you may be accounted worthy. Now, if you read in context, just before that, a couple of verses before, it's saying about, be careful because you get involved with the day-to-day activities, the day-to-day whatever, and next thing you get distracted and get very involved with different things you're doing and things of our daily life. The cares of our life can distract us, and then we are caught unawares and we're not ready. And that's why it says, watch and pray. And indeed, there is a devil, and his intense desire is to splinter and divide the church, but also to hurt ourselves, each one of us, individually. And so the effectiveness of us doing God's work, I am convinced, is directly related to how close you and I are to God and to please God, obeying Him and doing the things that are pleasing in His sight. And therefore it's so important to examine ourselves. So I do appreciate the sermonette, which is very appropriate and timely. And thank you, Jim, I appreciate for that. But today I want to look at a little bit from the point of from what authority do we get the instructions of the Passover and days of unleavened bread. I want to look at some of the details beyond it from the Scripture, and then conclude from the point of how to prepare ourselves for them. So my first question is, from what authority do we get the instruction to observe the holy days? And that's pretty simple. And that's basically, you and I can see that in Leviticus 23. So let's just turn to Leviticus 23, starting in verse 1. And so today's sermon is more of a Bible study around these holy days and see how we keep them, basically extracting that and reminding us of that as we prepare for the Passover and days of unleavened bread. So in Leviticus 23, starting in verse 1, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, the feasts of the Lord. You see, in the world, when you mention these holy days, people think, oh, well, they're Jewish. They're Jewish feasts. Well, that's not what the Bible says. It doesn't say the feasts of the Jews. They are the feasts of the eternal, of the Lord. Excuse me. I really struggle with my sinus, particularly this time of the year, but it just keeps draining, so excuse me, I just have to keep clearing it now and again. So these are the feasts of the eternal. And then it says, which you shall proclaim. So here we have God speaking first. It's a message from God. So it's not a pagan tradition. These are the feasts of the eternal. The word feast is a Hebrew word called moed, which basically means an appointed time, a time which is appointed. And then it says, which you shall proclaim. Basically, it's saying to the priesthood to proclaim. In a sense, it's the Sabbath was being proclaimed by God. It's one day every seventh day. But these days does require some analysis from the priesthood with God's instructions that he gave to Moses for us to proclaim when those days are. And then it says, to be a holy convocation. In other words, to be a time when we are to be together. It's a convocation. We are commanded to get together during the holy days, which includes the Sabbath. But we are commanded to get together. So the authority comes from God. Then in verse 3 it talks about the Sabbath. But then in verse 4 repeats again. These are the feasts. And it says, of the eternal, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. And then it goes through them. On the 14th day is the Passover. On the 15th is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And you have a holy day on the first day, it says on verse 7, and on verse 8 it says on the 7th day likewise you have a holy convocation as well. So it's very clear. I mean, I really think it's so clear. The 14th is the Passover. The 15th is the first day of unleavened bread. For 7 days, which means the 7th is the 21st. So there it is. The 14th is the Passover, the 15th is the first day of unleavened bread, and the last one, the 7th, is the 21st of the calendar that God has given to us through Moses and through the Jewish people, as it says in Romans as well. So that is the instruction that we have about the Passover. It comes from God and the days of unleavened bread. But the question then is, how do we observe them? And in the New Testament, as we know, the actual observation is slightly different than in the Old Testament. And so we go to Paul's instruction here in Colossians chapter 2. That's a very interesting scripture that a lot of people don't understand. But let's look at that in Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, chapter 2. And then we're going to start in verse 13. And then it says, and you, being dead in your trespasses and the uncircumcision of your flesh. So he's talking to Gentiles, you, Gentiles, because Colossians, he was talking to a Gentile church, being dead in your trespasses, in your sins, and the uncircumcision of your flesh. In other words, you have not been physically circumcised because you're Gentiles. Now he, Christ, has made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses. So Christ has forgiven you all your sins. And then verse 14, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements. And he wiped out the handwriting, that is the dictate of requirements. And what is those requirements? It's interesting to look at the Greek word here. Requirements is actually dogma. And if you read in context, but I mean, let's just quickly look at a little bit further ahead. For instance, in verse 20, it says, therefore if you died with Christ from the basic principle of the world, why? As though having the world, you subject yourself to regulations. Those are also, it's the same Greek word, dogmatizo, which is regulations. So he's actually talking in context here of these regulations, which verse 21 he describes them, which says, do not touch, do not taste, do not handle, which all concern things which perish with the using according to the commandments and doctrines of man. So he's actually saying men have put in certain laws and certain regulations and certain requirements to get themselves quote unquote clean, and that is in context what he's talking about. In fact, in context, you can also see verse 8, where it says of the same chapter, beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the traditions of men, according to the basic principles of the world, which are not according to Christ. So Yah is saying, people out, you Gentiles, you had a list of requirements that through your pagan religions and things like that, of requirements that you had to do through your pagan beliefs, basically Gnosticism, that's that knowledge, philosophy, etc. You had these requirements, and these were pagan, and Christ wiped them all out and erased them. So that says Christ, so therefore continuing on verse 14, having wiped out the handwriting of those requirements, which we've seen, which are human philosophies, which according to the traditions and commandments of men, as we saw in verse 22, they were against us, which was contrary to us. You see, these have got nothing to do with God's law. He's talking to these Gentiles. They had these requirements in their pagan religion, and Christ has nailed those things to the cross completely. And he says, which is contrary to us, and he has taken out of the way, having nailed it to the cross. He's nailed all that to the cross. All those pagan things are dead. And having disarmed principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them in it. And then he says, therefore, verse 16, so, or therefore, let no man judge you. Let no man judge you in food or in drink. In other words, how you do certain things as far as food and drinks, or regarding a feast, a festival. In other words, how you keep a festival, or the new moon. What do you mean the new moon? Because the only festival that falls on the new moon is the Day of Trumpets. So, or the Sabbaths. So let no man judge you how you do those festivals, or the new moon, which particularly pointing to the Day of Trumpets, or the Sabbaths, plural. So it's not just the weekly Sabbath, but the annual Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come. Yes, the holy days, the Day of Trumpets, the weekly and the annual Sabbaths, they all point to things of the future. When you really look at understanding God's plan of salvation, which is exemplified by God's holy days, point to things of the future. The Passover, when they were instructed about the Passover and leaving Egypt, pointed to a thing of the future, which was Christ's Passover as the Lamb of God. Pentecost, at that time when it was given to them, pointed to something of the future, which was the giving of the Holy Spirit. The Day of Trumpet points to something of the future, which is the coming of Christ. The Day of Atonement points to something of the future, which is the putting away of Satan. The millennium, the Feast of Trumpets, points to something in the future, which is the millennium. The last great day points to something in the future, which represents the great white throne judgment and the eternity thereafter. So all those things are a shadow of things to come. So let no one judge you regarding how you keep those things, which are only a shadow of things to come, but the body of Christ. But the body of Christ. If my Bible's even got a little thing on the side there, and it says literally body, not substance, body, but the body of Christ. The word is, in a number of Bibles, is in italic, which is not there. So it was added by the translators. So basically reading verse 16 and 17 together, says, let no man judge you but the body of Christ, regarding how you keep the Sabbath and holy days and things like that. So who has the authority to tell us how to observe the holy days, particularly in the New Testament context? God's church, which is the body of Christ. I mean, the previous chapter, Colossians chapter 1, verse 24, which might be in the same page in your Bible, or might be just one page back, at the end of verse 24 of Colossians chapter 1, it says, for the sake of his body, which is the body of Christ, which is the church. So the body of Christ is the church. So the church of God has been instructed by the apostles, and we have instructions here how Christ instructed the apostles how to observe the feast days. For instance, how to observe the Passover, as we will look at in a little later in the New Testament dispensation, which obviously is different than how they observe the Passover in the Old Testament. So there is the observation, how we observe the holy days in the Church of God is being given to us by Christ, which is the head of the body, and he is passed it to us through his word, which is in the Bible, and through his apostles, which are the instructions we receive, and that's what we do. So the authority, who is the authority, is God. God is the authority that has given us the instruction to observe his holy days, and him through his church has given us the instruction of how to do it. And that's exactly what we do it. So let's go back and start with the Passover. First, let's just briefly turn to Exodus chapter 12, because let's look at historically and Exodus chapter 12. In Exodus chapter 12, you can see there the instruction when the Passover was first instituted. And it says in verse 1, then the Lord spoke to Moses, and then he explains that on the 10th day of the month, he was to put out a little lamb. And then the lamb would be of the first year, so it was a little lamb. So just a 1-year-old lamb, a perfect lamb without blemish, as you can see in verse 5. And you keep it from the 10th day until you get to the 14th. Now, you and I know that the 14th starts at sunset of the 13th. As the 13th comes to sunset, and then the sun is set, it's the beginning of the 14th. So you're keeping it until you get to the 14th. When you get to the 14th, that means the sun is set, the day is beginning. All right, in God's way of looking at it, that's the night part, but the actual day, night and day, as even we know from Genesis, the first day, night and day, evening and day was one day. It was the first day, and then evening and day was the second day, and so on. So that's how God counts it. And it says, you keep it till the 14th. We're reading now in verse 6. And all assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. At twilight. So as the sun goes down, you get that twilight. It's still not dark, but there's still a bit of light. You can still see it. That's twilight. You'll kill the lamb at the 14th. And you shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses. So you take the blood and basically put it around the door, on the posts and on the lintel at the top. And then they shall eat the flesh of that lamb roasted with fire, with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs. They shall eat it. So it's a meal after sunset. So it's probably quite a late-ish meal. You think about it. If they're going to kill the lamb and take the blood out, and then we're going to still roast it, it's going to be a late-ish meal, not necessarily quite early. But and then it says, do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted. So the instruction is very specific how to cook it. And then it says, and you shall let none of it remain till morning. And what remains of it in the morning, you will burn. So they were to stay in their houses, as we read later on. They were to stay in the houses till morning. And in the morning, they were to destroy, burn out completely whatever was left over. They were to destroy it. And then in verse 11, it says at the end, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. Verse 12. For I'll pass through the land of Egypt on that night, as it says elsewhere, at midnight, and I'll strike at the firstborn of the land of Egypt with both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I'll execute judgment. Verse 13 says, and when I see the blood, I'll pass over, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. And this shall be a memorial of you. So here's the Passover. It's very clear. The Passover, which we saw in Leviticus 23, is on the 14th. At twilight, that means immediately after sunset, you make the sacrifice, you roast it, you put the blood on the doors, don't forget that, and roast it and eat it. And that evening at midnight, the Lord will pass over. A lot of people think it's the angel of the Lord. It doesn't say that. It says the Lord, I will pass over, which is interesting. So it's Christ himself that does that. So he will do that at midnight. That is the Passover. That's when he passes over, at midnight. And then they were not to leave the house until the morning. It says that. In the morning they were to destroy whatever was left over. So that is very clear when is the Passover. For one, it's not on Easter Sunday. For two, it's on the 14th of the month. Now, interesting coincidence is that in the calendar that we have, which is passed to us by the Hebrews, you never have, quote unquote, Passover during a Sunday. Yes, you may have it on Sunday night, but that's actually falls onto a Monday. That's interesting enough. While the pagan churches have Easter Sunday, in God's calendar, you never have it because of the postponements. You never have it on a Sunday, which is very interesting, and I think it says a lot about how God foresaw all these things and planned all these things. But anyway, that's just a side factor in there. Now, let's see how Jesus Christ gave us the example of when he kept the Passover and how. Because the importance for us is the New Testament application now. And so let's turn to Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26. And we'll read that at verse 2. Says, and you know that after 2 days is the Passover, and the Son of Man will be delivered to be crucified. So Christ is saying, listen, you know that we have the Passover around the corner, and the Son of Man will be crucified. Will be delivered and crucified. It's very clear that that will actually happen on the Passover. And then a little further, on verse 17, on the same chapter, verse 17 says, now the first of the unleavened bread. I'm not reading the words in italics because they were added. Right? So the first of unleavened bread. Now, was that really the first day of unleavened bread? No. But you think about it. It's like, for instance, at the home office. If we have to leaven, a few days before the days of unleavened bread, you've got everything out of the house because you've already leavened. So basically, the Jews had to get the things out of the house, had to leaven, all that. And so they were not taking it out of the house on the very last day, because they had to get rid of it. They had to, maybe the truck that came out and took the rubbish or whatever it is to the dumps came the day before. So by that time they had already. So it's not the first day of unleavened bread, but it was already the beginning of that unleavened bread season, because the Passover is already to be kept without leaven. It's not saying that on the 14th you cannot eat leavened bread, but the Passover was eaten with unleavened bread. And so it was the beginning of that unleavened bread season. So the disciples came to Jesus saying to him, where do you want us to prepare for you the Passover? So this was in fact even before the 14th, like the 13th or something like that. Says, hey, where do you want us to prepare? So they already were kind of getting themselves unleavened and getting themselves all ready for it. And he said, go into the city to a certain man and say to him, the teacher says, the time is at hand, and I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples. Now, it does not say Christ will keep any meal. There are people that says, oh, well, Christ kept one day early. No, he did not. He kept the Passover. He himself said it. It was the Passover. And so the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover. And when evening came, as we know, after sunset, when evening came, that is the beginning of the 14th, he sat down with the 12. And so it says, and they had that meal, and they had the Passover as per the Old Testament instructions. Let's jump, so that was on the 14th, the beginning of the 14th. So let's jump to verse 26. Verse 26, it says, as they were eating, so they had a Passover meal. They had a Passover meal. And this is a colloquialism, because I will show you a little later that the Passover was actually, the new symbols were actually instituted after they actually eaten the meal. But, like if you have a meal at home with people, and you have the main meal, and after you finish eating the meal, you still sit at the table and still fellowship and talk. And you can still technically, in colloquialism, say, well, we're still eating. But you actually had eaten already the main meal, but they were still sitting at the table and talking and chatting, and the wine was still on the table, the bread is still on the table, and things like that. But the meal had already completed. And I'll show that to you a little later. But continue. Jesus took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to the disciples. So he instituted the new symbols. And we can see there's the bread, and he took the cup, verse 27, and the wine, and he says, drink it all. And this is the blood of the new covenant, representing the new covenant, which is shed for many for the remission of sins. But I say to you now, I'll not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it with you in my Father's kingdom. And then they sang the song, and then they left, and things like that. So, but the point here is that at that time, Christ changed the symbols, introduced new symbols of bread and wine. These are the New Testament symbols. And this is what we keep in the church, the new symbols which Christ instructed. And then you can see in verse 31, and then they went out, and then Jesus said to them, all of you will be made to stumble because of me this night. For it is written, I'll strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. And then Peter says, no, not me, I'll never leave you, and things like that. So we can see that this was the night of the Passover, was the night of the 14th, Then Peter says, I'll never deny you. And then verse 34 says, yeah, and Jesus said, surely I say to you that this night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. So the denial of Peter was on that same night. So we have, putting it back to make it very clear, the sun went down, they had the Passover meal as per the Old Testament. As they had finished the meal, but they were still sitting down, Christ introduced the new symbols. Then they left, and then Peter denied Christ 3 times before the rooster crowed. So it's important to see that sequence. All right. Now I specifically mentioned about Peter denying because I want to take that to link the rest of the story, what happens afterwards. So let's look at John chapter 18. John chapter 18. John chapter 18, and we're going to look at it in verse 25. Now Simon Peter, that's Peter, stood up and warmed himself. Therefore they said to him, You are not also one of his disciples, are you? And he denied and said, No, not me. I'm not. And one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him, whose ear Peter cut off, said, Oh, did I not see you in the garden with him, with the sword and cutting the ear? Come on. I saw you. And Peter said, No, not me. No, not me. And the rooster crowed. So you can see that's that same night. That's that same night. And look at it in verse 28. And then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early in the morning, so it kind of coming on to dawn. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, into that Greek area, Greek court, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. You see, the Jews had not yet eaten the Passover. They were eating it on the 15th, not on the 14th. See, Christ ate it on the 14th as per commandment. Christ did not break the commandment. He kept the Passover. But they were already then, at that time, eating it on the 15th. Just like today, the Jews basically eat it on the 15th. At that time, they already were skewed, and they were already, the religion was, in a sense, let's call it corrupt. They were not observing the Passover on the 14th, but they were observing it on the 15th. And let's jump a little bit further ahead on John chapter 19 verse 14. And it says, Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour. Now, this is the book of John. Now, the book of John was written about the year 90 of the current era, it was after Christ. Which means the book of John was written about 20 years after the destruction of the temple. Which means they were no more under a Jewish environment. They already kind of left, and they were in Gentile areas. And therefore, the way they counted the times, 20 years after they left Jerusalem, they were counting like the Gentiles from midnight. And therefore, when it says about the 6th hour, that means it was 6 o'clock in the morning, as we count today, the Gentiles, the way the Romans counted. And he said to the Jews, Behold your king. So this was like, as we can see, the 14th. Dawn had came in, and it was the preparation day for the Passover, because it will be on the 15th. that the way they kept it, the Jews kept it, not the way God instructed it, but they kept it on the 15th. And they didn't want to go inside there because they didn't want to, quote unquote, be unclean, so they could keep the Passover. So they didn't go into the court there. And so it was the preparation day. So the disciples had prepared before, as we know, for the Passover. They had prepared the day before. And Christ kept it on the 14th. But now this was the day part of the 14th, and they're going to keep the Passover on the 15th. This is important for you to understand, because there are people that get confused with this. So I'm trying to go into it gently, and I hope it's clear for you. And then a little bit further in verse 31, it says, therefore, verse 31, because it was the preparation day. This is just, Christ had died already. The crucifixion had occurred. It was the preparation day. So it was the day part that the body should not remain on the cross on the Sabbath. For the Sabbath was a high day. You see, it was a preparation day for the Sabbath. And the Sabbath was a high day because it was the 15th, was an annual holy day. So it's a Sabbath, a preparation day for the Sabbath. You see, there's a preparation day that Christ and the apostles had for the Passover, the 14th. He ate. He then was betrayed. He then was crucified. But that was the preparation day for the Sabbath, which is the 15th. So it is important to understand this. That was a preparation day for the Sabbath, which they called the Passover. Verse 42, for instance. And so there they lay Jesus, because the Jews' preparation day for the tomb was nearby. So they buried him before the sunset, before the Sabbath, which was the 15th. So he was buried on the 14th, before the Sabbath, because it was a high day. As we saw, that preparation day was a high day. So I wanted to go through this so that you understood that Christ kept the Passover on the 14th. He was also betrayed on the 14th. On the 14th, he changed the symbols to bread and wine. On the 14th, during the day portion, he was crucified. On the 14th, he also died. So all this happened on the 14th. He was betrayed, he suffered, he was beaten, and he died, all on the same day, the 14th, the day of the Passover. Now, he instituted new symbols of the bread and wine, but he also instituted additional symbols, specifically the foot washing symbols. So let's look at that very quickly, which is the institution of the ceremony of the foot washing, which is in John chapter 13. In John chapter 13. John chapter 13, from verse 1 through 17, is basically the instruction about the foot washing. Now, you look at it here in verse 2, and it says, and supper being ended. And that is correct. And that's in a majority text. And supper, that is the Seder, the Jewish Seder as they call it. They had already finished the Old Testament application of the Passover, of eating the lamb and the meal. And supper being finished, the devil already, having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. And Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from the Father and was going to God, he rose from supper. But understand that they were still eating, as technically they say they were still eating, but the meal was already finished. So he rose from supper, he laid aside his garments, took a towel, and girded himself. And then he poured water and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them. And Simon Peter said, "No, I'm not going to wash my feet." And then Christ says here in verse 8, "If I do not wash your feet, you have no part in me, or with me." And then Peter says, "Well, then wash my whole body, my hand, my toes, everything else." So he says, and Christ said, No. He who has bathed, in other words, is being baptized. That's the bath, that's baptism. That's the commitment at baptism. He that has already been baptized needs only to wash his feet. But he's completely clean. And you are clean, but not all of you. Because Judas Iscariot was there. For he knew who would betray him, therefore he said, "You're not all clean." And so when he washed their feet, he said to them, "Do you know what I've done?" And he says, "Well, do the same." In verse 15, that you do as I've done to you. You follow the same example. And so that's what we do. We do the foot washing. So Christ brought in this new ceremony that teaches humility and a proper attitude of service, of foot washing. Now, let's look at the proper sequence or order. What comes first? Is it the foot washing, or is the bread and wine? So let's look at that order. So we can see here in chapter 13, in verse 10, that he says, "And he who's bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean, and you are clean, but not all of you." There was one of them that was not clean, and we know it was Judas. Okay? And then in verse 18 it says, "I do not speak concerning all of you. I know whom I've chosen, but the scripture may be fulfilled. He who eats bread with me has lifted up his heel against me." And now I tell you before it comes, that when it comes to pass, you may believe that I am he. All right, and then verse 21, "And then when Jesus said these things, he was troubled in spirit and testified and said, 'Most surely I say to you, one of you will betray me.'" And verse 22, "Then the disciples looked at one another, perplexed about whom he spoke." 23, "Now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples whom Jesus loved." That was John. And so Simon Peter therefore motioned to John and said, "Listen, John, ask Christ who it was of whom he spoke that is going to betray you." And then verse 25, it says, "Then leaning back on Jesus' breast, he said to him, 'Lord, who is it?'" In other words, John asked Christ, "Who is it?" And Jesus answered, "It is he to whom I shall give a piece of bread when I've dipped it." And having dipped the bread, he gave it to Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon. So you can see they've done the foot washing. Now there's this questioning, who is the betrayer? And he says, "Well, it's the one that is going to put his hand with me." And then he says, they both put their hand in there, and then Christ dips it and gives it to him. "No, take it, I've given it to you." So they both go together there, and he gives the bread. And after the piece of bread, verse 27, Satan entered into Judas, and then Jesus said to him, "Whatever you do, do quickly." They didn't know what he was talking about. They thought he was talking about something about the purse and the money, etc., etc. And verse 30, having received the piece of bread, he, that's Judas, then went out immediately, and it was night. He immediately. So Judas Iscariot did the foot washing, or rather, Christ did the foot washing to Judas Iscariot. Then Christ gave him the piece of bread, and then he left. Judas did not take part of the New Testament symbols of bread and wine. And let's look at that in Matthew 26. Matthew 26, where we read a little earlier, Matthew 26, verse 20. Matthew 26, verse 20. It says, when evening had come, he sat down with the 12, so that we've read before. Now verse 21. As they were eating, and as we know this was after the meal, but they were sitting there, surely I say to you, one of you will betray me. Now you know this conversation about one of you will betray me was after the foot washing. And they were exceeding sorrow. Each one of them says, is it me or this? And he answered to him, it is who dips his hand with me in the dish and will betray me. So they both went with the hand, and Christ dipped it for him and gave it to him. And then the Son of Man goes just as it was written to him, but woe to that man to whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would be been better, good for that man that he had not been born. Then Judas was betraying him, answered and said, Rabbi, it is I. And he said, you're right, you've said it, it's you. And then he ducked out, as we know. And then, continue verse 26, as they were eating, Jesus took bread, etc. So the foot washing was first. Then it was this thing about who is it, the bread. Judas left immediately after that, and then was the actual new symbols of the bread and wine. So the order of the Passover, the foot washing is first, then the bread, and then the wine. And you can see that the bread first, then the wine. And the bread represents the suffering of Christ for our healing of his body, which happened during that night and during the morning, etc. And the wine represents the blood which was shed, which is at the end of that suffering, which was his death for our sins. And so that's why that sequence, the foot washing, then the bread, and then the wine. It's a very logical sequence. All right, now that we've seen how the Passover was done in the Old Testament, how Christ added and changed the symbols, rather, for the New Testament, let's look at the meaning for us today in the New Testament as Paul explains it in Corinthians. So we're going to read in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. Now, here in this section is talking about a problem that existed in the church, about somebody that was committing a sex sin. And he said, listen, you've got to take that man out. You've got to take that man out and put him out of the church. Your glorying is not good, that you're thinking, well, you're very spiritual and very forgiving, etc., because you're allowing him in there. That's no good, because a little leaven leavens the whole lump, it spreads out and does that. So, and there it is in verse 6 and 7. Your glorying is not good. Do you not know a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore purge out the whole leaven, that you may be a new lump. Purge out that old sin. Put it out, that you may be new without sin. Since you are unleavened. So he was talking to them about during the days of unleavened bread. For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. You see, our Passover is not the killing of a lamb, and therefore celebrated with eating lamb on the night of the 14th, because Christ is our Passover. So our Passover is not the meal. Our Passover is Christ. And look a little bit further in chapter 11. Chapter 11. And we're going to read in verse 20. Chapter 11, verse 20. That's still of 1 Corinthians. Chapter 11, verse 20. Therefore, when you come together in one place, when? That's obviously on the 14th, to celebrate the New Testament Passover, he says, therefore, when you come together in one place, it is not to eat the Lord's Supper. Therefore, in God's church, we do not eat the Lord's Supper. This is important to understand, because that's what other churches out there says, oh, well, where are you going to have the Lord's Supper? Well, it says it's not to eat the Lord's Supper. And then he says, if you want to eat, you eat it at home, you have a meal at home, but when you come to have the New Testament Passover, is not for that meal. That was an Old Testament ceremony. The New Testament is different. And look at verse 23. Look verse 23. It says, for I received from the Lord, and which I delivered to you, that the Lord Jesus, on the same night which he was betrayed, took bread. When did Jesus take the bread? On the night that he was betrayed. Which means was before he died. And that's what we need to do. It says, do it as I have done. So those people that keep the Passover on the 15th, because they say, oh, well, we do it on the 15th to celebrate Christ's death. They're not doing what Christ did, because Paul is saying on the night that he was betrayed, which was before he died. That's what we have to do. And when people say, oh, well, we do it only to celebrate Christ's death, then they're only thinking about the wine. They're not thinking about the bread, which is the suffering of Christ before his death. And they're not thinking about the foot washing, which is the attitude of service before that as well. So continuing that in verse 23, it says, Jesus on the same night which he was betrayed took the bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, take, eat. It's my body for which broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. So we do it in remembrance of him. At the same time he did it, on the night that he was betrayed, in the same manner, he also took the cup after supper. Remember, this is after supper, after the meal. So again, it restates the same thing. It was after the Jewish Seder, let's call it that, because we're not celebrating the Old Testament symbols, but we're celebrating the New Testament symbols, the bread and wine and the foot washing, which comes first. And it says the cup here, this cup of the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me. As often as you drink it. Or people say, oh, well, therefore I do it as often as I want. I do it every week or every 3 months or whatever it is. No, because when do we keep the Passover? When is the Lord's Passover? It's the 14th. It's once a year. So as often as you drink it, which is annually as a memorial, that's as often as you do it. That's how often you do it. As often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, verse 26, you proclaim the Lord's death till he comes. And therefore then it says in verse 27, therefore who eats this bread and drinks this cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself. And this is very important. It ties in with our sermonette we had today. We've got to examine ourselves. And it really is sad, because then it goes on, if we don't discern the Lord's body. And yes, the Lord's body is Christ's body, but the Lord's body is the church. And if we don't discern the body, which is the church, and we're not caring for the church, then people get sick, and many have died. And brethren, how many brethren in the church, not discerning the church, have done things to hurt the church and the community, and people have gotten stress and got ill because of that and have died with heart attacks. I have seen ministers in God's church dying of heart attacks. Kathy and I have seen it, of heart attacks, because of things that other members in the church have done to other members. And that is sad. And that's exactly what it says. We've got to examine ourselves and discern the body, the Lord's body, not just Christ's body, but Christ's spiritual body. And that we've got to discern, and we've got to be careful. So that's what it is. The Passover is a renewal of our acceptance of Jesus Christ's sacrifice. And some think that, oh well, my sins are forgiven at Passover, so all I have to do is come to church once a year for Passover service. Wrong. Because the Passover, yes, is commanded. But you know, Christ died and is our new high priest and is in heaven to intervene for us at the opportune time that we need. And whenever we need, we approach Him on our knees and we ask for forgiveness, and His blood will be applied in that instance and will be forgiven at that instance. You do not have to wait for Passover. Yes, Passover is commanded. We have to keep the Passover. But we must live every day, every year. And then the question may be, who can keep the Passover? Well, you can read in Exodus 12. I'm not going to go there at this stage but it says it's those that are circumcised. And you know, in Romans, Paul said that we're circumcised because we got the circumcision of the heart, which is actually symbolized by our baptism. So it is for baptized members. Can children keep the Passover? No. But if they're adult enough and they're mature enough to learn, they can sit and watch. But they don't keep the Passover. Only baptized members of God's church. And also, it's not a time for fellowship. It's a solemn evening, and it's a solemn time. Yes, bring a towel, bring a Bible, etc. But it is a solemn time to be respected, and I believe we should really take that evening with great respect. I know some people approach it maybe in slightly different ways. Personally, I prefer to take that evening with great respect as a solemn evening. And then the next evening is the night to be much observed. Because remember, and now let's go to Exodus 12. Exodus 12. Exodus 12. Exodus 12, verse 40. It says, now the sojourning of the children of Israel, it was the traveling, the sojourning, the living in temporary dwellings of the children of Israel. It was of Abraham's children through Israel, not Abraham's children through Ishmael, not Abraham's children through Esau, not Abraham's children through his other wife after his wife died. Can't remember the name now, but anyway, it was Abraham's children through Israel. And those children are the ones who ended up living in Egypt. Their sojourning in total time was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, on the very same day, and you can read that in Galatians 3:17, that is when the promises were given to Abraham, and 430 years exactly after Abraham was given the promise, and says, leave to go to a land that I'll give it to you, and I'll give you these 7 promises. Exodus 12, 430 years to the same day, the same night, they left Egypt. And does God the thing on time? He does things on time. He's a master of timing. And on that same day, it came to pass that all the armies of the Lord went out of the land of Egypt. When did they leave the land of Egypt? They left Egypt by night. He says, verse 42, it's a night of solemn observance to the Lord for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is a night of the Lord, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout generations. They could not have left on the 14th, because remember, on the 14th, they killed the lamb, they put the blood, they had to stay in houses. At midnight, the Lord passed over, killed the firstborn of those that did not have blood over the houses, over the doorposts. And then they were to stay in their houses, as you read there. They were not to leave their houses. And boy, did they obey that commandment. They were very afraid after seeing all the other people die and all the other plagues. They surely obeyed. But that was one time they obeyed. I mean, they were rebellious, but that time we know they obeyed. And they were not allowed to leave their houses till the morning. If there was any extra meat left, they were to burn it the next morning. And Pharaoh said, get out. And he says, okay, get out. But 3 million of them had to get together, etc., spoiled the Egyptians, and then they left. And by the time they left was the following night, the 15th, the night of a solemn observance. The night that they left by night, exactly 430 years after Moses was told to leave his land to go to the land where he sojourned, not Moses, beg your pardon, where Abraham left the land, 430 years. So it's a night we much observed. Look also in Numbers 33, Numbers 33, verse 3. And they departed from Ramses on the first month, on the 15th day of the month. They departed, they left Egypt on the 15th day of the month, on the day after the Passover, which was the 15th. The children of Israel went out with boldness in the sight of all the Egyptians, because the Egyptians were burying their firstborn. So they went out on the 15th, not the 14th, they went out on the 15th. It's very clear. Look at also Deuteronomy 16, verse 1. Deuteronomy 16, verse 1. And it's talking about on the first month, and it says, in the month of Abib, at the end of this says, the Lord your God brought you out of Egypt by night. They left Egypt at night. And it says they left on the 15th. And they left at night. So how do we observe that? We observe it by getting together as families. Maybe you can get together in a little private restaurant. You can have some privacy. It's not a religious service, but it is a good time for part of the conversation to be explaining the meaning of that day and the value of it, what it means to us in the New Testament. And then after that, we get onto the days of unleavened bread. So in Exodus 12, Exodus 12, verse 15. Exodus 12, verse 15. 7 days shall you eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats unleavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. And so we read that we are to keep the days of unleavened bread for 7 days, from the 15th to the 21st. There's 2 Sabbaths, and basically, as we saw in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, that's a type of sin, of taking sin. In fact, let's look at there very quickly. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. First Corinthians chapter 5, and look at in verse 8. Well, starting in verse 7. Therefore, purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. So this was during the days of unleavened bread. They were unleavened, for Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast. Which feast? The feast of unleavened bread. Not of the old leaven, for with the leaven of malice and wickedness, nor with the leaven of malice or weakness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So we got to put sin out, and we ought to keep the feast. Yes, we're already unleavened, but really take that old leaven out, which is that, spiritually speaking, that sin. We need to take that out and keep the feast in the right way without leaven. Leaven is basically a type of sin. It's a reminder of us taking sin out, like they left Egypt on the 15th, a symbol of sin. We are to put sin out completely for 7 days, 7 representing completely. Now, how do you prepare for unleavened bread? Well, spiritual preparation is very important. That's why about a month ago, with the very intent of starting to prepare you spiritually, I gave a sermon about, are you dead with Christ? And that is a spiritual preparation that we need for unleavened bread. That's on the website. And I also have given you a handout of a Passover season study guide with a number of scriptures that you can go through to help you preparing for unleavened bread and the Passover in the right way. It's got a number of scriptures, different concepts, different readings, various prophecies. So that will help you in your Bible study to prepare. So spiritual preparation is first and foremost. But then again, there's the physical preparation. The physical preparation is taking out your leaven out. And I also have as a handout at the back what is leaven and what is not leaven. Look out for leavening, what is leaven and what is not leaven. So I've got there at the table at the back that you're welcome to take. So basically, why do you take leaven out? Well, it's a physical thing, like foot washing is a physical thing. Like the bread is a physical thing. Like the wine is a physical thing. Like baptism is a physical thing. But it reminds us, it teaches us spiritual lessons. And that's what it is. So do it as a family project. Do it well in advance. Start becoming conscientious about labels in articles that you buy. For instance, not all matzos is unleavened. You might not know, but you've got to look at that. Some matzos is leavened. And there's also recipes in the church's website for little cookies and breads that you could make, and other ladies in the church have. You can share with each other and bake things and make that a very pleasant time as far as eating unleavened food. Brethren, God ordained these feasts to teach us spiritual lessons of His plan of salvation. The death of the Lamb opened the doors for the plan of salvation of Israelites, for them to leave Egypt. But the great symbol is the death of our Lamb, which is Christ, opens the door for our spiritual promised land, which is eternal life. And that is basically a reminder through God's holy days. Jesus Christ kept the Passover, as we saw, is our Passover lamb. His sacrifice opens the doors for our salvation and for us to lead